Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 6. Now, this collects the final few issues of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. Now, Swamp Thing is a comic book series from DC Comics that was originally created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, but Alan Moore took over this series in the mid-80s and really sort of made Swamp Thing his own. Now, most of the issues collected in here are written by Alan Moore, but there's one issue in here written by Stephen Bissette, and there's another issue in here written by Rick Veitch, who would actually take over as head writer of the series after Alan Moore's run is over and done with. Now, I've already reviewed the first 5 volumes of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those reviews. Now, earlier in this run, when Alan Moore was working with Stephen Bissette, a lot of the Swamp Thing comics were very much horror comics, with elements of dark fantasy, where you had Swamp Thing battling things like demons, vampires, ghosts, zombies, werewolves, and other supernatural creatures. Swamp Thing even got caught up in a battle between heaven and hell, angels and demons, and a dark god that wanted to destroy heaven. But when Rick Veitch started to do the illustrations for these comics, Alan Moore started to move away from horror and more into the realm of science fiction, and you especially see that with the issues collected in this volume. Now, the reason for this, according to Stephen Bissette, Alan Moore, when he writes a comic book script, usually he tailors the script to whichever artist he's working with. And Rick Veitch was doing most of the illustrations at this point in the series, and Rick Veitch is much more of a science fiction fan than he is a horror fan, so as a result, the comics started to become more sci-fi based. So, Book 6 picks up where Book 5 left off. Now, the issues collected in Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 5, actually crossed over with the Batman mythos, and in that volume, Abby was arrested in Gotham City, and so Swamp Thing waged war on the city, and for a brief period, Swamp Thing and Batman became enemies. Until the authorities ultimately agreed to let Abby go, but then Swamp Thing was seemingly murdered by the Sunderland Corporation. What actually happened was they destroyed his body, but Swamp Thing's consciousness left the Earth. So, in the issues collected in this volume, you follow Swamp Thing as his consciousness travels through space and ends up on all these different alien planets where he either ends up helping or in some cases unintentionally terrorizing different alien cultures. Now, that's the overarching plot of this, but each issue collected in here can also work as a standalone story. Now, this volume opens up with a 2-part story comprised of the issues Mysteries in Space and Exiles, and these issues feature the character of Adam Strange, who is a character originally created by Julius Schwartz. Adam Strange is a man from Earth who is sometimes transported to this planet called Rann to be Rann's champion and defender, but it turns out the people of Rann have a tendency to make fun of him behind his back. Now, the reason for this is because it turns out they want him there for something a little more than just being their champion. But Rann is suffering from a severe famine, and Swamp Thing ends up on this planet, and he can make plants grow, and he can bring vegetation back to life, so he offers to help them with this famine. But it turns out that the Thanagarians have also offered to help Rann, and they do not appreciate Swamp Thing's intervention at all, because it turns out they have an agenda of their own. But this was a really good 2-part story, and as is the case with a lot of Alan Moore's comics, there are some definite environmental themes being tackled here. And it works as a fun superhero story, but there are some definite darker themes being played around with here. Next we get an issue called Reunion, which is written by Stephen Bissette and illustrated by Rick Veitch, and this one actually takes place on Earth, and Swamp Thing doesn't even appear in this issue, and this sort of returns the series more to a horror tone. And this story is very loosely based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. because it features the character of the Patchwork Man, who was a character from the older Swamp Thing comics before Alan Moore took over, and this character is specifically drawn to look like the Frankenstein monster. But what's disturbing about this character is the fact that he's actually Abby's father, who was killed when Abby was a child and then brought back as this horrible monster by his brother, Anton Arcane. So, the plot of this story is the Patchwork Man is trying to reunite with his daughter Abby, and he's literally starting to fall apart because he's only a stitched-together zombie. And the ending of the story is actually pretty heartbreaking. But while the story itself is pretty sad, there is some definite dark humor in the story. There are scenes in this story that are taking place in hell. Now, Abby's uncle and the Patchwork Man's brother, Anton Arcane, is dead at this point, and his soul has been condemned to hell. And in hell, he's being tortured by the demons. And the way the demons are torturing him, they're basically playing with his head as if it were a football. So there's some definite dark humor done almost in the style of, like, EC Comics. Next we get an issue called Loving the Alien, and this one's illustrated by John Tullibin, and of all the Swamp Thing stories collected in this volume, this is the one that feels the most pure science fiction. But basically in this story, Swamp Thing's consciousness encounters this cosmic being that is basically a sentient machine. And this machine is female, and it actually ends up falling in love with Swamp Thing, and it actually ends up having a kind of sex with Swamp Thing. Not exactly consensual on Swamp Thing's part. But this was a really interesting story, and it's also interesting how the entire story is told from this machine's point of view, and it's written almost more as a prose story rather than a traditional comic book, but John Tullibin's artwork in this is just so freaking bizarre, and I hate to use this word because I feel this word gets used way too freaking much, but it is kind of psychedelic. Next we get an issue called All Flesh is Grass. Now, while this one is technically science fiction, there are some definite horror elements in this story. Basically, what happens in this story is Swamp Thing ends up on a planet of sentient plants. Here's the issue, though. Swamp Thing, in order to create a new body, needs to use plants. So what ends up happening would basically be the equivalent of if a bunch of people were forcibly merged together to form one being. And Swamp Thing, even though he doesn't intend to do any harm, he does become kind of the antagonist of this story. But one of the people on this planet happens to be a Green Lantern, and he's the only one who can save these people who have been merged into the Swamp Thing. But if we were dealing with human characters here, this would almost be like a Junji Ito kind of story, the way these characters are all forcibly merged into this one giant. Actually, this reminded me a lot of the Clive Barker story, In the Hills, the Cities, only that story involved human characters forming into a giant. And there are actually some interesting characters in this story, like there's this priest who has lost his faith in O, which is what they call God on this planet, but when all this starts happening, he believes it's O's punishment on him for losing his faith, and throughout the story he starts to regain his faith. After this, we get an issue called Wavelength, which is written and illustrated by Rick Veitch. Basically, this issue follows the character of Metron as he tells Darkseid, who is primarily a villain from the Superman comics, he tells Darkseid about an encounter he had with the Swamp Thing. Basically, Swamp Thing and Metron ended up in this space outside of our known reality, and they witnessed all time and space at once. This issue's actually pretty interesting, and Rick Veitch actually does set up something that he would do later on during his run on Swamp Thing, because you see a vision of Abby with John Constantine, and it actually foreshadows something that does happen between Abby and Constantine later on during Rick Veitch's run. The next issue collected in here is called Loose Ends Reprise, and in this one, Swamp Thing finally returns to Earth, and he goes after the Sunderland Corporation, who are the ones responsible for his exile from Earth. And he fucks them up. He really, really fucks them up. Especially the one who ordered his execution to begin with. What he does to this guy at the end of this issue is actually really freaking gruesome. And the final issue collected in here, which is also the final issue of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, is called Return of the Good Gumbo, which is a silly title, but this one is really good as well, and it's illustrated by Stephen Bissette and Tom Yates and Rick Veitch. And basically in this issue, Swamp Thing reunites with Abby, but it's also about Swamp Thing trying to decide whether or not he should use his powers to save Earth's environment the way he saved Rand's environment, or if he should give the human race a chance to save the environment themselves. So this story definitely deals with environmentalism, which is a major theme that you saw running throughout this entire series. But Alan Moore did it in a way where it never came off as too preachy or too in your face. Now, as I pointed out earlier, Rick Veitch took over as the head writer of this series after Alan Moore was done with it, and his Swamp Thing comics pretty much picked up where Alan Moore left off. But to be honest though, if you read Alan Moore's run from like book 1 all the way to this one, it really does feel like a complete story. And yes, I know what these comics are technically in continuity with the older Swamp Thing comics, even though Alan Moore retcons the origin. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, it really does feel like its own series. Now, the character of John Constantine from these comics eventually got his own spin-off series, Hellblazer. Also, in a weird way, Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, even though that series very much stands on its own, it is, in a weird way, kind of a sequel to Swamp Thing. Because in Swamp Thing, you have the character of Matt Cable, who was Abby's husband, who ended up getting possessed by the spirit of Anton Arcane, and after Swamp Thing defeated him, he ended up in a coma, and eventually Matt Cable does die, and after he dies, he's reincarnated as Morpheus's pet raven in the Sandman series. Now, you do not have to read Swamp Thing in order to understand Sandman, but knowing that Matthew the Raven is actually Matt Cable does add a new dimension to that character. So, Hellblazer and Sandman are technically spin-offs of this, and Sandman had a few spin-offs of its own, like the Books of Magic and, of course, the Lucifer comics. Now, recently you had the Swamp Thing TV series that was cancelled after one season. I haven't watched it yet, but from what I understand, that series is specifically based on Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, rather than the Swamp Thing comics that came before. But yeah, that was my review on Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 6, the final volume of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, and bye.